In the dead of the night, Pastor Leon Gilmore walks into his home, expecting peace. But what he finds will haunt him, and the community, forever. His pregnant wife, Keisha, is in bed with his HIV-positive father. In a violent rage, Leon slashes her stomach, killing their unborn child. The betrayal is unimaginable, and the aftermath will leave everyone questioning how far trust can truly stretch. How does a marriage built on faith and trust spiral into something so horrifying? How does love turn into betrayal, and betrayal into bloodshed? Before we unravel this shocking case, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Everyday True Crime for more cases of love, lies, and unthinkable crimes. Pastor Leon Gilmore had a way of commanding a room. He wasn't just another preacher, he was the preacher. The kind of man people looked up to, trusted, and even feared a little. He carried himself with confidence, spoke with authority, and had a way of making his congregation feel like he held the answers to life's toughest questions. Whether he was standing at the pulpit or leading a marriage counseling session, his words carried weight. He talked about faith, loyalty, and the importance of family. His wife, Keisha, was the perfect complement to his image. She was young, beautiful, and devoted. She played the role of the pastor's wife flawlessly, always standing by his side at church functions, always smiling in photos, always holding his hand in public. And when she got pregnant, it only made the picture even more perfect. People would stop them after Sunday service just to say how blessed they were. A man of God bringing another life into the world, what a gift, the older women at church would say, shaking their heads in admiration. But what people saw on Sundays wasn't the full story. Behind closed doors, things were tense. Leon had always been a man who paid attention to details. He had to be. Being a pastor wasn't just about preaching. It was about managing people, understanding their needs, and knowing when something wasn't right. And lately, something about Keisha wasn't right. It started with little things. She would leave the house more often, saying she needed to get fresh air. When he asked where she was going, she'd give short, vague answers, just out for a bit, or running errands. She started spending more time on her phone, tilting the screen away when he walked by. And at night, when they lay in bed, she felt distant. It wasn't like before, when she would rest her head on his chest and fall asleep to the rhythm of his breathing. Now, she curled up on her side, facing away from him. At first, he told himself it was just hormones. Pregnancy could change a woman's emotions, make her moody, make her restless. But then there were other things. Her scent would be different when she came home, sometimes a faint trace of men's cologne lingered on her clothes. Her excuses became thinner, her patience shorter. And then there was the way she looked at him. It was subtle, but it was there. She had always looked at him with admiration, like he was her protector, her provider. But now, sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, her gaze would shift. It was something else now, something cautious, almost guilty. One night, about a month before everything fell apart, Leon tried to confront her. They were sitting at the dinner table, eating in near silence. He had spent the whole day trying to push the thought away, trying to convince himself he was just imagining things. But by the time they sat down to eat, he couldn't ignore it anymore. "You been okay lately?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. Keisha didn't look up from her plate. "Yeah, why?" "I don't know. You just seem different." She poked at her food with her fork. "I'm fine, Leon." A few seconds of silence. "Are you sure?" Now, she looked up, her eyes sharp. "Yes, Leon. I said I'm fine." That was new. Keisha had never snapped at him before, not like that. He nodded slowly and dropped the conversation, but in his gut, he knew something was wrong. The problem with being a pastor was that he had seen too many marriages fall apart to pretend his was invincible. He had counseled too many couples, listened to too many confessions. He had heard every excuse in the book. It just happened. It didn't mean anything. I didn't plan it. And now, for the first time, he wondered if he was about to hear those same excuses from his own wife. Leon had never felt so worn out in his life. The day had been one meeting after another, church affairs, counseling sessions for couples struggling with their marriages, and the usual grind of making sure the ministry was running smoothly. But as the clock ticked later and later, all he wanted was to get home to his wife. He had promised her he'd be back early, but that promise had long faded into the rush of deadlines and responsibilities. When he pulled into the driveway that night, it was nearly 1:15 a.m. The house looked quiet, too quiet. The porch light, which Keisha always left on for him, was off. The blinds in the living room were drawn tight, casting the whole house in darkness. It unsettled him for a brief moment, but he brushed it off. Maybe she was tired. She had been carrying their baby for months now, and she had been more exhausted than usual lately. Leon opened the front door, slipping inside as quietly as he could, though he couldn't shake the odd feeling that something wasn't right. The house was completely still. Not even the faint sound of a television or music drifting from their bedroom. Just silence. His steps took him down the hall, and when he reached their bedroom door, he pushed it open. He was expecting to see Keisha, probably curled up in bed, waiting for him. But what he saw instead froze him in place. Keisha was lying in bed, her body bare beneath the sheets. And beside her, just as naked, was his father, Franklin Gilmore Sr. His father. Leon's mind went into overdrive, his body frozen in shock. He didn't understand what he was seeing. This couldn't be real. His father. His own father. With his wife. In their bed. His stomach churned, and he felt a wave of nausea rise up his throat. For a long, endless moment, there was nothing but silence. Keisha's eyes widened in horror when she saw him, but there was no explanation, no apology. Franklin tried to pull the covers over himself, his old body fumbling with the sheets, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. Leon had seen it all. The confusion in Leon's mind quickly gave way to a crushing reality. This wasn't just some affair. This wasn't a mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was something much worse. Franklin, a man who had been diagnosed with HIV nearly a decade ago, had already risked his own life. But Keisha, his wife, the woman who had carried his child, had just endangered her own life, their unborn child's life, and even his life. He knew about his father's condition. It wasn't a secret. For years, Franklin had battled the virus, his health hanging by a thread, but Leon had always hoped that his father's condition would stabilize. But to see Keisha, his pregnant wife, lying next to him, with no protection, no care for the dangers, felt like a slap in the face. The reality hit him like a freight train. His wife, the mother of his child, had placed them all in jeopardy. She had risked her life. She had risked their baby's life. And worst of all, she had risked his life, the very life she had promised to protect. Anger swelled in Leon's chest. It burned in his veins, so hot and so fierce he couldn't think straight. His father, his own flesh and blood, had done this. Franklin had been the one to break all the rules. But Keisha had willingly let him. And now, in that moment, it felt like there was no going back. Leon's breath quickened, and his pulse thundered in his ears. He could barely see straight. The rage inside him drowned out everything else. His eyes flicked around the room, landing on the kitchen knife block in the hallway. Without thinking, he turned and rushed to the kitchen. His hands were shaking, but his anger was stronger than the tremor. He grabbed the sharpest knife he could find, his mind too clouded with fury to care about anything else. He charged back into the bedroom, the knife gripped tightly in his hand. Keisha's voice, broken, pleading, was the first thing he heard. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. He wasn't listening to her anymore. He didn't want to hear her excuses. He didn't want to hear her apologies. In one motion, he was on her, slashing. Keisha barely had time to scream before the blade sliced through her abdomen. It was an explosion of pain, blood, and confusion. She cried out, her voice raw and desperate, but Leon wasn't there. He was somewhere else, in another place, consumed by the rage that burned through him. He wasn't just hurting her, he was hurting everything she had taken from him. Franklin was already on his feet, stumbling out of the bed. The old man's eyes were wide, his body trembling as he bolted for the door. He didn't fight back. He didn't even try to stop Leon. He just ran, leaving his son to deal with the mess he had caused. Keisha's screams echoed in Leon's mind, but the sound felt distant. All he could see was blood, the blood that stained his hands, the blood that stained the sheets, the blood of the child that would never take a breath. He stood over her, breathing heavily, watching as she bled out in front of him. In that moment, all he could think was one thing: she killed us all. He hadn't just lost his wife. He hadn't just lost his child. He had lost everything. The night air was thick with tension, but it was pierced by the sound of Keisha's screams, sharp, ragged, full of terror. Her cries echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls and breaking the silence of the early morning. Neighbors who had always known the Gilmore family as the epitome of respectability were jolted awake by the gut-wrenching sound of desperation. It didn't take long before several of them dialed 911, reporting the scene of chaos coming from the Gilmore home. By the time paramedics arrived, it was clear that the situation was grave. Keisha, barely conscious, was rushed to the hospital. Her blood soaked the sheets, her body failing to cling to life. The doctors did everything they could to try and save her, but they couldn't bring back the child she had carried for so many months. The baby, the little life that was meant to bring joy and hope, did not survive. Back at the Gilmore house, the police arrived soon after the ambulance had sped away with Keisha. What they found inside was nothing short of chilling. Pastor Leon Gilmore, covered in blood from head to toe, sat motionless on the living room couch. His hands were stained crimson, his gaze fixed on the floor as if he was lost in some dark void. There was no resistance, no attempt to flee or deny what had happened. When the officers entered the room, all Leon did was whisper, his voice barely audible, the words heavy with a deep, unsettling finality. "She killed us all." It was a haunting statement, but it was the only thing he said. He didn't protest when the cuffs were snapped around his wrists. He didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't ask for a chance to explain. His eyes remained vacant, and his voice was distant, as if he had already detached himself from the world he had once known. The weight of his actions hung in the air like a suffocating cloud. Keisha, despite the odds, clung to life in the hospital. She was conscious for brief moments, but her mind was a blur, and the trauma left her too weak to speak. She had no way of fully understanding what had happened, no chance to explain the horrifying events that had transpired in their bedroom just hours before. Meanwhile, Franklin Gilmore Sr., Leon's father, had gone into hiding. Once news of the attack broke, he disappeared. A tip-off led police to a relative's home, where Franklin was found, still refusing to speak to reporters or anyone else. He remained locked in his silence, not offering any explanation for his actions, not answering the difficult questions that hung heavy in the air. How had this happened? How had a man, who had raised his son and been a part of the family for decades, brought such devastation upon his own flesh and blood? The media quickly descended on the case. The community, stunned and in disbelief, was left reeling from the tragedy. People who had once praised Pastor Leon for his wisdom and guidance were now asking how this could happen. How could a man of God, a man who had preached love and faith, do something so unthinkable? How could he take the life of his unborn child and nearly end his wife's life? The shock waves rippled through every corner of their church, their community, and their social circles. Friends and family couldn't believe it. Leon had always been the rock, the steady force in everyone's lives. How could he have crossed that line? What had happened to that calm, composed pastor they all knew. But as investigators dug deeper, the shocking truths began to surface. Whispers filled the air, rumors that began to paint a darker picture of Keisha's relationship with Franklin. Some close to the family hinted that this wasn't the first time Keisha had been involved with Franklin in such a way. There were vague mentions of secrecy, of moments where Keisha had been strangely distant or unwilling to talk about her relationship with Leon's father. Could it be that she had been hiding something all along? Some even went as far as suggesting that Keisha had been coerced, that she had been silenced by Franklin, or perhaps even by others who had known about the affair and kept quiet. Fear gripped her, a fear that, if the truth were to come out, would destroy everything she held dear, her marriage, her family, and her own reputation. She might have believed that if she kept quiet, if she played along, she could protect herself and her future. But that belief, as it turned out, had come at a staggering price. The investigation began to unravel layers of deception, secrets, and betrayal, and it soon became clear that things had been much more complicated than anyone could have imagined. There were signs of cracks in Leon and Keisha's marriage long before that fateful night, tensions that had slowly grown over the months. But what caused the explosion, the sudden, violent eruption of rage from Leon? Was it just the affair, or was there something more lurking beneath the surface? What everyone had once assumed was the perfect family, the loving husband, the devoted wife, the man of God and his supportive partner, had been anything but perfect. The cracks in the facade were there all along, hidden beneath the polished exterior of the Gilmore family. And now, as the truth began to leak out, the world would be forced to confront the ugly reality of what had transpired in that home. For Keisha, lying in a hospital bed, the road to recovery would be long. She wasn't just physically wounded. The emotional scars from the betrayal and the violence she had endured would be harder to heal. She had been caught in a storm of deceit, and now she had to find a way to rebuild her life from the ruins. But for Leon, there was no redemption. There was no turning back. His life, his future, had already been decided. The trial of Pastor Leon Gilmore unfolded quickly, moving through the court system with a sense of urgency that matched the gravity of the case. The courtroom was filled with somber faces, family members, churchgoers, and even members of the media who had been tracking the case from the moment the horrific events had unfolded. The story was too shocking to ignore, and the weight of what had transpired that night was too much for the community to simply let go. The prosecutors wasted no time in making their case. They painted a vivid picture of the brutal events that had taken place on February 28, 2024. They spoke of the betrayal, the shock, and the uncontrollable rage that had led Leon to violently attack his wife, Keisha. But more than that, they emphasized the fact that, despite any emotional trauma Leon may have felt, no betrayal, no matter how devastating, could ever justify the violence that occurred. The prosecutor's voice rang out in the courtroom, as they reminded the jury that Keisha had not only been physically harmed but that the baby she had carried for months had been taken from her in an instant. It didn't take long for the jury to deliberate. Just 3 hours. It was clear that, despite the complexity of the situation and the emotional toll it had taken on everyone involved, the law was not going to look the other way. Leon's actions were too brutal, too unforgivable. The jury returned a guilty verdict, and the courtroom fell into a tense silence as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence. Leon sat motionless at the defense table. His once proud, authoritative posture seemed to have evaporated, replaced by the hollow, distant look of a man who had already given up on understanding the enormity of his actions. When the verdict was read, there was no visible reaction from him, no sigh of relief, no protest, no remorse. It was as if he had already mentally disconnected from the world he had once been so deeply a part of. The judge, who had presided over the trial with a strict, no-nonsense demeanor, made sure to make his stance clear. He spoke directly to Leon, addressing him as a man who had once been a leader of the community, a respected pastor, a man of God, someone trusted with the most intimate details of people's lives. But on that fateful night, Leon had shown that he was capable of something far darker than the man of faith the world thought they knew. The judge's voice was stern and unwavering as he sentenced Leon Gilmore to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was still as the words echoed through the air. There would be no second chance for Leon, no opportunity for him to rebuild his life. The family he had once held so dear, his wife, his unborn child, and his community, were gone, shattered by the very hands that had once built them up. Franklin Gilmore Sr., Leon's father, was taken into custody shortly after the trial. Though he had not been directly charged for his role in the violence, there was still the looming question of his involvement with Keisha, his son's wife. Investigators had yet to bring formal charges against him, but they had not ruled out the possibility of legal action. The public was left to wonder whether Franklin's relationship with Keisha, which had been kept hidden for so long, would bring further consequences. Keisha, on the other hand, was still in the hospital, slowly recovering from the physical trauma that had been inflicted upon her. Her wounds were serious, but the doctors had managed to stabilize her, and with time, she would heal. But the physical scars were just the beginning. Keisha would carry the emotional scars of that night for the rest of her life. The betrayal of her husband, the violence she had experienced, and the loss of their child weighed heavily on her. The life she had known before would never return. She would have to rebuild, not just her body, but her sense of self. She would have to find a way to forgive herself, to forgive Leon, even if forgiveness seemed impossible. As the days passed and the trial came to an end, the small town of Cleveland, Ohio, was left to pick up the pieces. The church where Leon had once preached would forever be tainted by the actions of its former pastor. The people who had once called him a friend, a leader, a guide, now had to come to terms with the fact that the man they had trusted had caused immeasurable harm. The Gilmore family, once seen as a shining example of faith and unity, would never be the same. But for Keisha, the real journey was just beginning. She had survived a nightmare, but the world around her had crumbled. Now, she would have to fight, not just for her physical recovery, but for her mental and emotional healing. The road ahead would be long, and it would be difficult. But if she could survive what had happened, she could begin to rebuild her life, piece by painful piece. This case is a chilling reminder that sometimes, the worst betrayals come from the people closest to us. Love, trust, and faith, shattered in a single night of rage. Was this an act of blind fury, or was it premeditated revenge? Could anything have stopped this from happening? If this story shocked you, like and subscribe to Everyday True Crime for more cases that uncover the darkest sides of human nature.